Well, hi everyone, and welcome to another episode of Unstoppable Mindset. I've been looking forward to this one for a while. We have Donnie Pitchford as our guest today. You're probably going, who's Donnie Pitchford? Well, let me tell you. So, years ago, I started collecting old radio shows, and one of the first shows that I got was a half-hour episode of a show called Lum and Abner, which is about a couple of characters, if you will, in Pine Ridge, Arkansas. And I had only heard the half-hour show sponsored by Frigidaire, but then in 1971, when KFI out here in Los Angeles, the 50,000 watt clear channel station, started celebrating its 50-year history, they started broadcasting as part of what they did 15-minute episodes of Lum and Abner. And I became very riveted to listening to Lum and Abner every night. And that went on for quite a while. And so I've kept up with the boys, as it were. Well, several years ago, some people formed a new Lum and Abner Society, and Donnie Pitchford is part of that. I met Donnie through Radio Enthusiast of Puget Sound and Yesterday USA. And so we clearly, being interested in old radio and all that, had to have Donnie come on and talk with us. So Donnie, or whatever character you're representing today, welcome to Unstoppable Mindset.
Huh? I'm glad to be here.
He does that very well, doesn't he? Huh?
It's a little tough sometimes. I'm really glad to be here. Thank you.
Well, I appreciate the audio parts of Lum and Abner that you all create every week, and just the whole society. It's great to keep that whole thing going. It's kind of fun. We're glad that it is. But let's talk about you a little bit. Why don't you start by telling us about the early Donnie growing up and all that? I'm assuming you were born, and so we won't worry about that. But beyond that,
I think so.
Yeah. Well, there you are. Tell us about you and growing up and all that, and we'll go from there.
Well, I was born in East Texas and left for a little while. My family lived in Memphis, Tennessee for about 7 years, and then moved back to Texas in 1970. But ever since I was a kid, I hear this from cartoonists everywhere. Most of them say, I wanted to be a cartoonist when I was 5 years old. So that's, in fact, I had to do a speech for the Texas Cartoonist chapter of the National Cartoonist Society, and that was my start. I was going to say the same thing, and the president said, whatever you do, don't do that old bit about wanting to be a cartoonist at age 5. Everybody does that. So I left that part out. But that's really what I wanted to do as a kid, and I would see animated cartoons. I would read the Sunday comics in the Memphis Commercial Appeal, and then at some point, my dad would talk about radio, and my mother would talk about listening to radio. We would have the reruns of the Lone Ranger television show, and things like Sky King and other programs along those lines. And my parents would always say, well, I used to listen to that on the radio, or I would hear Superman on the radio, or Amos and Andy, or whatever was being rerun at that time. And that fascinated me. And I had these vague memories of hearing what I thought were television programs coming over the radio when I was about 2 years old. I remember gunshots. I remember, like a woman crying and just these little oddball things. I was about 2 years old. And I kept thinking, well, why are we picking up television programs on my mother's radio? Turns out it was the dying gasps of what we now call old-time radio. Mm-hmm. And so at least I remembered that. But when I was about, I guess, 8 or 9, my dad took me to lunch at a Lum's restaurant in Memphis. And I saw that name, and I thought, what in the world? I said, what kind of name is that? And my dad told me about Lum and Abner. And he said, it reminded him of the Andy Griffith Show, or the Beverly Hillbillies. And I said, I'd love to hear that. He said, you'll never hear it. He said, those were live. They don't exist. But years later, I got to hear them. So
yeah.
But that's how I grew up, wanting to be a cartoonist and coming up with my own characters and drawing all the time and writing stories and that sort of thing.
So when did you move back from Memphis to Texas?
July 2nd, 1970.
Hmm.
I just happened to look that up the other day.
And how
But
old were you then?
I was 12 when we came
Okay.
back.
All right.
So
So,
I was in junior high and I was trying to find an audience for these comic strips I was drawing on notebook paper. And finally, some of the kids got into them, and I just continued with that goal. And I knew that as soon as possible, I was going to start drawing comics professionally. So I thought, but I kept trying. I've lost you. I can't hear you. Can't hear you. Don't know what's happened.
how about now?
Yes, 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 yes. Can you
I
hear
wonder
me?
what happened. Yeah, I hear you. I wonder what happened.
I
Well,
don't know. I hope I didn't hit something here.
nope. I heard you. I heard you say you couldn't hear me, so I wouldn't worry.
Oh.
It
That
was
was my biggest
probably
fear.
it was probably Philo Farnsworth coming to try to sabotage us. Since
Yep.
he invented the glass for the picture tube. I'm sure he
Used
did.
to teach about that guy.
I'm still with Fred Allen. I think that they called television the new medium because that was as good as it was ever going to get.
Medium. I got you.
Oh gosh. Well, anyway, so you went on into college. What did you do in college?
Well, more of the same. I started listening to some old time radio shows, even as far back as high school, and I was interested in that. Went to college first at a college called Kilgore College here in East Texas, and then to Stephen F. Austin State University. And I was majoring in first commercial art and then art education. And I thought, well, if I can't go right into comics, maybe I can just teach for a while. I thought I'll do that for a couple of years. I thought it wouldn't be that long. But while I was at Stephen F. Austin State University, the campus radio station, I was so pleased to find out, ran old-time radio shows. This was in 1980. There was a professor named Dr. Joe Oliver who had a nightly program called Theater of the Air. And I would hear this voice come over the radio. He would run, one of the very first 15-minute Lum and Abner show I ever heard was played by Dr. Oliver. He played Jack Benny. He played The Whistler, Suspense, just a variety of them that he got from a syndicated package. And I would hear this voice afterwards come on and say, "It's jazz time. I'm Joe Oliver." And I thought, where have I heard that voice? It's just a magnificent radio voice. Years later, I found out, well, I heard that voice in Memphis when I was about 10 years old on WREC radio and television. He was working there. He lived in Memphis about the same time we did. Heard him on the campus station at Nacogdoches, Texas. Didn't meet him in person until the late 90s. And it was just an amazing collection of coincidences. And now, of course, we're good friends now. He's now the announcer for our audio comic strip. So
Right.
it's amazing how all that came about.
Well,
But,
I remember listening to sort of the last few years of old radio. I think it was, I don't remember the date now, whether it was 57 or 58. I think it was 57. The Kingston Trio had come out with the song Tom Dooley. And one day I was listening to KNX radio in Los Angeles. We lived in Palmdale. And I heard something about a show called Suspense that was going to play the story of Tom Dooley. And I went, well, that sounds interesting. And I want to know more about it. So I listened, and that started a weekly tradition with me every Sunday, listening to yours truly, Johnny Dollar, and Suspense. And they had a little bit of the FBI and Peace and War. And then it went into that went off, and Have Gun Will Travel came on. And then at 6:30 was Gunsmoke. So I listened to radio for a couple of hours every week, every Sunday night, and thoroughly enjoyed it. And so that's how I really started getting interested in it. Then after radio went off the air, a few stations out in California and on the LA area started playing old radio shows. Somebody started doing, because they got the syndicated versions of The Shadow and Sherlock Holmes with Sir John Gielgud and Sir Ralph Richardson. And I still maintain to this day that John Gielgud is the best Sherlock Holmes. No matter what people say about Basil Rathbone and Nigel Bruce, I still think Sir John Gielgud was the best Sherlock Holmes.
He was very, very good. Yes.
Yeah, he was. And so listen to those. But, radio offers so much. And even with what the whole Lum and Abner shows today, my only problem with the Lum and Abner shows today is they don't last nearly long enough. But that's another story.
Are you talking about the comic strip adaptations?
Yes.
Okay. Do you know how much art I would have to do?
I bet.
Every week to lengthen that?
Oh, I know. But they're fun. And, we enjoy them. But so you met Joe, and as you said, he's the announcer now, which is great. But what were you doing then when you met him? What kind of work were you doing at the time?
Well, of course, there was a gap there of about, I guess, 15 years after college before I met him. And what ended up happening, my first teaching job was an art job, teaching art and graphic arts at a small high school in Hawkins, Texas. And that was a disaster. It wasn't a very good year for me. And so I left that, and I had worked in the printing industry. I went back to that. And that was all during the time that the National Lum and Abner Society was being formed. And so I printed their earliest newsletters, which came out every other month. And we started having conventions in Mena, Arkansas, and in the Rio Pine Ridge. And my fellow ossifers, as we call ourselves, and you hear these guys every week on the Lum and Abner comic strip. Sam Brown, who lives in Illinois. Tim Hollis from Alabama. Tim is now quite a published author who might be a good guest for you one day.
Sure.
Just two great guys. We had a third officer early on named Rex Riffle who had to leave due to various illnesses about 1991. But we started having our conventions every year starting in 1985. We had some great guests. We brought in everybody we could find who worked with Lum and Abner or who knew Lum and Abner. We had their head writer, Roswell Rogers. We had actors. I'm sure you've heard of Clarence Hartzell.
Mm-hmm.
He was Ben Withers, of course, on the old Vic and Sage show. He was Uncle Fletcher. We had Willard Waterman, Parley Bayer, some of their announcers, Wendell Niles. And my memory is going to start failing me because there were so many. But we had Bobs Watson, Louise Curry, who were in their first two movies. We had Kay Lineker, who was in their third movie. The list goes on and on. But now, we had some amazing talent.
When did Chester Locke pass away?
He passed away. Well, Tuffy passed away first.
1978.
78, and Chet died in 1980.
So okay.
Sadly,
so neither of them. Yeah.
We didn't get to meet. We didn't meet either one of them. I've met Mrs. Locke. I've met all of Chet's children, several grandchildren. We spoke to Mrs. Goff on the phone a time or two, and also Tuffy's daughter. Didn't get to meet them in person, but we met as many of the family as we could.
Still, it's quite an accomplishment all the way around. And so you taught. You didn't have success. You felt really much at first, but then what? You taught for quite a while, though, didn't you?
Yes. I went back to the printing industry for about a year, and in the summer of '85, about 2 weeks before school started, I got a call that they needed someone to teach broadcast journalism at Carthage High School, and we had a department called CHS-TV. I ran that for 25 years. I taught classes. We produced a weekly television program, weekly radio program. We did all kinds of broadcasts for the school district and promotional video. And then in the last I think it was the last 10 years or so that I worked there, we started an old time radio show. And we were trying to come up with a title for it. And just as a temporary placeholder, we called it the Golden Age of Radio. Finally, we said, well, let's just use that. And I think it's been used by other people since,
Yeah.
but that was the title we came up with. I think I think it was in 93 or 94, 95, somewhere in there. And we started out, we just ran old time radio, and the students, I would have them research and introduce like maybe 45 minutes of songs of music, from the 30s, 40s, maybe early 50s, big band and Sinatra and Judy Garland and you name it. Then, when the classes would change, we would always start some type of radio program that was pre-recorded that would fill that time so the next class could come in and get in place, and everybody participated, and they went out live over our cable television channel, and we would just run a graphic of a radio and maybe have some announcements or listing of what we were playing. And we did that for several years, usually maybe 2 or 3 times a year. And then in I think it was 2004 or so, we had an offer from a low power FM station, which was another county over, and we started doing a Sunday night 1-hour program each week, and I think we ended up doing close to 300 of those before I left, and so we got old time radio in there, one way or the other.
Well, I remember. For me, I went to UC Irvine in the fall of 1968, and by the spring, the last quarter of my freshman year, I had started getting some old radio shows, so started playing shows, and then in the fall, I started doing a 3-hour show on Sunday night called the Radio Hall of Fame, and we did radio every night. What I didn't know until actually fairly recently was our mutual friend Walden Hughes actually listened to my show on Sunday, and so did the Gassmans actually. But we had a low power station as well, but it made it up, and so people listened to it. And I've always been proud of the fact that during the time I ran the Radio Hall of Fame, I'd heard of this show called 60 Minutes with a guy named Mike Wallace, but never got to see it. And it was only much later that I actually ended up starting to watch 60 Minutes. Of course, I always loved to say I would have loved to have met Mike Wallace and never got to do it. But I always said he had criminal tendencies. I mean, my gosh, what do you think? He was the announcer on radio for the Green Hornet, a criminal show, right? Sky King, a lot of criminals. So clearly the guy had. Anyway, it would have been fun to meet him. But
and his name was Myron Wallach at the time, wasn't it?
You're right.
I think that's right.
But it was fun, and so I've actually got some Sky King shows and Green Hornets with him. So it's kind of cool. But
right.
I still really do believe that the value of radio is it makes you imagine more. I've seen some movies that I really like for that. The original Invasion of the Body Snatchers with Kevin McCarthy back in 1955, I thought was such a good movie because they didn't show the plants taking over the humans. It was all left to your imagination, which was so cool. And they changed all that in the later remake of it with Leonard Nimoy, which I didn't think was nearly as good, not nearly as suspenseful. But anyway, that's just my opinion. But radio for me was always and continues to be a part of what I like to do. And so I've been collecting shows and enjoying it, and of course, listening to Lum and Abner. So what made you decide to finally end teaching?
Well, I could only do that so long. I was getting very tired, getting kind of burned out. And I had to have a change. Something had to change, and I was able to take a few years early and retire. And I still, the whole time, I had that. It was like a haunting feeling. I wanted to be a cartoonist. I would pray, Lord, is there some way? Can I get out of this, and can I do what I really want to do? And I had some mentors that I was finally able to meet. People that I would write letters to as a kid, A cartoonist and comic book editor named George Wildman was one of them. He was nice enough to answer my letters when I was a kid, and I'd send him drawings, and he would encourage me, or he would send little corrections on there, And another one was a gentleman named Hy Eisman, who passed away recently at age 98 on his birthday. But men like this inspired me, and it kept at me through the years. I finally met George in 1994 at a convention of the International Popeye Fan Club, and I met Hy the same way, and also a writer named Nicola Cuddy, who wrote some Popeye comics. I met him the same way, same event. We all became friends, and I had a good friend named Michael Ambrose of Austin, Texas, who published a magazine devoted to the Charlton Comics Company. Sadly, he's deceased now, but Mike and I were talking before I retired, and finally I got out of it, and he said, now that you're out of that job, how would you like to do some art? I said, that's what I want to do. So he gave me the opportunity to do my first published work, which was a portrait of artist George Wildman. It was on the cover of a magazine called Charlton Spotlight. Then I did some work for Ben Omart, who is Bear Manor Media publisher, for some books that he was doing. One was a Mel Blanc biography that Noel Blanc wrote. Did some illustrations for that. This was all happening in 2010 and after that. So I was getting rolling, doing the kind of work I really wanted to do. And there was a gentleman named Ethan Nobles in Benton, Arkansas, who wanted to interview me. I'd gotten, I don't know how I forgot how he got in touch with me. Maybe he heard me on Yesterday USA, could be. Wanted to interview me about Lum and Abner. And so he was starting a website called First Arkansas News. And somewhere in early 2011, we were talking, and I said, you want this to be an online newspaper, right? He said, yes. I said, what about comics? He said, I hadn't thought about that. So I said, well, you're a big Lum and Abner fan. What if could we do a Lum and Abner comic strip? He said, well, where would I get, who would do it? And I said, me. So I drew up some proposals. I drew some model sheets, and we did about 4 weeks of strips, and got approval from Chester Locke Jr. And he suggested, there's some things he didn't like. He said, the Lum looks too sinister. He looks mean. I said, well, he's mad. I said, he's mad at Abner. This won't happen every week. He said, okay, I don't want Lum to be a... I said, well, they get mad at each other. That's part of that's the conflict in the comedy.
Boy, do they get mad at each other.
Yeah. So we ironed it all out, and we came up with a financial agreement and had to pay royalties and one thing and another. And we started publishing online in June 2011. And about 6 weeks later, the Mena newspaper, the Mena Star in Mena, Arkansas, which was the birthplace of Lum and Abner, Chet Locke and Norris Goff, they picked it up. And then we had a few other newspapers pick it up. And, we're not worldwide syndicated in print, but we're getting it out there. And, of course, we're always online. But and the First Arkansas News went under 3 or 4 years later. And so now we have our own website, which is lumandabnercomics.com. So that's where you can find us online.
So where's Pine Ridge?
Pine Ridge is about 18 miles from Mena, Arkansas. Mena is in western Arkansas, and Pine Ridge is about 18 miles east, I believe. I'm trying to picture it in my mind. But it's down the road, and it actually exists. It was a little community originally named for a postmaster. It was named Waters, Arkansas. And in 1936, the real Dick Huddleston, he was a real person who owned a store there in Waters, and was friends with the Locks and the Goffs, with their parents as well as Chet and Tuffy. But he proposed a publicity stunt and an actual change of name to name the community Pine Ridge. So that's how that happened.
Now, in the original 15-minute episodes, who is the narrator?
Well, it depends what era. Their first one, trying to remember now. Gene Hamilton was an early announcer in the Ford days, which was the early 30s.
Mm-hmm.
We don't have anything recorded before that. Charles Lyon was one of their early announcers, possibly uh, for Quaker Oats. I don't have any notes on this in front of me. I'm just going on memory
Okay.
here. Memory at the end of a long week.
Yeah.
Gene Hamilton was their Ford announcer. Carlton Brickert announced the Horlicks malted milk and did the commercials when they from 1934 to 38 or so. Lou Crosby took over when they were sponsored by General Foods by Postum, the Postum commercials, and Lou stayed with them on into the Alka-Seltzer era. And his daughter, the celebrity daughter, is Kathy Lee Crosby, you may remember.
Right.
And she and her sister Linda Lou were a couple of our guests at the National Lum and Abner Society convention in 1996, I think. Let's see, Gene Baker came after Crosby. And then in the 30-minute days was Wendell Niles
Wendell Niles, yeah.
in the CBS, the 30-minute series. And Wendell, we also had him in Mina, super nice guy. When it got into the later ones, 1953, 54, I don't remember that announcer's name. That's when they got into the habit of having Dick Huddleston do the opening narration, which is why we now have Sam Brown as Dick Huddleston doing that every week. So
was
we
it
picked that
actually
up
Dick, was it actually Dick Huddleston?
No, it was Norse
Yeah.
Golf. Tuffy always played the part of Dick Huddleston.
Okay.
The only
I wondered about
the only
that.
time that, as far as I know, the only time the real Dick Huddleston was on network radio was at that ceremony in Little Rock, Arkansas, when they changed the name of the town. That the real Dick Huddleston spoke at that event, and we discovered a recording of that.
I was
So
just going to ask if there's a recording of that.
there is, yeah, it's on 12-inch, 78 RPM discs,
Wow.
and they were probably the personal discs of Lock and Golf, and they weren't even labeled. And I remember spinning that thing when Sam Brown and I, after we found it, it was down in Houston, and we brought them a batch of discs back. And I remember spinning that thing and hearing the theme song being played. I said, this sounds like a high school band. And suddenly we both got chills because we had heard that, I don't know if it was the Little Rock High School band or something, but it's like, can this be? Yes, it was. We thought it was long lost, but it was that ceremony.
Wow.
So that was a great find.
Well, hopefully you'll play that sometime, or I'd love to get a copy. But
Yeah, we played it on Yesterday USA.
Oh, okay.
And so it's out there.
Well, that's cool. Well, yeah, I wondered if Dick Huddleston actually ever was directly involved, but I can appreciate that. As you said, Tuffy Goff was the person who played him, which was that was pretty cool. They were very talented. Go ahead.
I was going to say that's basically Tuffy's natural speaking voice.
Yeah.
When you hear him as Dick Huddleston.
They're very talented people. They played so many characters on the show.
They did.
And if you really listen, you could tell, but mostly the voices sounded enough different that they really sounded like different people all the time.
Well, the fun thing are the episodes where, and it's carefully written, but they will do an episode where there may be 7 or 8 people in the room, and they get into an argument, or they're trying to all talk at the same time, and you completely forget that it's only 2 guys because they will overlap. Those voices are just so perfectly overlapped and so different. And then you stop and you listen, and you say, wait a minute, I'm only hearing 2 people at a time. But the effect is tremendous. The fact that they were able to pull that off and fool the audience.
I don't know whether I'd say fooled, but certainly entertained.
Well, yeah.
But they also did have other characters come on the show. I remember
Yes.
Diogenes was really,
Hmm.
that was a lot of fun listening to those
Oh, yeah.
episodes.
Yeah. That was Frank Graham.
Frank Graham, right.
Right.
But definitely a lot of fun. So you eventually left teaching. You decided you accepted jobs starting to do cartoons. What were some of the other, or what were some of the first and early characters that you cartooned or cartoons that you created?
Just, you mean by myself or?
Well, or with people, either way.
I did some things that were not published, just personal characters that I came up with that would mean nothing to anybody. But later on, I did a little bit of, I did a cover for a Popeye comic book, maybe 10 years ago. I finally got a chance to work with George Wildman, who was the fellow I talked about earlier, and it was some of the last work he did. And this was with Michael Ambrose of Argo Press out of Austin, Texas. And we did some early characters that had been published by Charlton Comics. Uh, they had they had characters. They were rip-offs. Let's be honest. Harvey had Casper the Friendly Ghost. Well,
Mm.
Charlton had Timmy the Timid Ghost. Um, there, there was Mighty Mouse. Well, Charlton Comics had Atomic Mouse. So, and there was an Atomic Rabbit, and Warner Brothers had Porky Pig.
Hmm.
Charlton had Pudgy Pig. So, but that was some of George's earliest work in the 1950s was drawing these characters. And George he was a master Bigfoot cartoonist. I mean, he was outstanding. And so Mike said, let's bring those characters back. They're public domain. We can use them. So I wrote the scripts. George did the pencil art. Well, he inked the first few, but Mike had me do hand lettering, which I don't do that much. So that was a challenge. And my friend Hy Eisman taught lettering for years and years. And so I was thinking, Hy's going to see this. This has to be good. So I probably re-lettered it 3 times to get it right. But we did, the very last story we did was Atomic Rabbit, and Pudgy Pig was a guest star. And then George's character named Brother George, who was a little monk who didn't speak, who lived in a monastery and did good deeds and all that sort of thing. He was in there. And this was the last thing we did together. And George said, since I've got these other projects, he said, do you think you can ink this? So that was a great honor to actually apply the inks over George's pencil work. And I also did digital color. But those were some things I worked on. And at one point, we even had Lum and Abner in the Dick Tracy Sunday comic strip. And that was because of a gentleman named Mike Curtis, who was the writer, who lived in Arkansas, was very familiar with Lum and Abner. And he got in touch with me and asked, this was in 2014, said, would it be possible for me to use Lum and Abner in a Sunday cameo? So I contacted the Locks. First thing Chet said was, how much? I said, I don't think they're going to pay us. I felt like Cedric Wehunt. No, mom. No, mom.
No, mom.
But, and I felt like he was Squire Skimp at the time.
Yeah.
But anyway, I said, it's just going to be really good publicity. So he finally went for it. And Lum and Abner had a cameo in a Sunday Dick Tracy comic strip. And about 4 years later, they honored me. This was Mike Curtis, the writer, and Joe Staten, the artist, who was another guy that I grew up reading from as a teenager, just a tremendous artist, asked if they could base a character on me. And I thought, what kind of murderer is he going to be? You know, I mean, was he going to be Idiot Face or what's his name? So, no, he was going to be a cartoonist. And the name was Peter Pitchblend. And he said his job was to illustrate a comic strip about a pair of old comedians. So, I mean, who couldn't be honored by that?
Yeah.
So I don't remember how long that story lasted, but it was an honor. I mean, it was just great fun. And then I had a chance to write 2 weeks of Dick Tracy, which was fun. I wrote the scripts for it, and then there's some other things. I was able to work with John Rose, a tremendously nice guy who is the current artist on Barney Google and Snuffy Smith. We did a story, a comic book story, on Barney Google, on Snuffy Smith, in a magazine called Charlton Spotlight, and I did the colors, digital coloring for that. So these are just great honors to me to get to work with people like that. And Nick Cuddy, I did some inking, lettering, coloring on some of his work. So just great experience and great people.
Going back to Atomic Rabbit and Pudgy Pig, no one ever got in trouble from Warner Brothers with that, huh?
Well, not on Atomic Rabbit. However, Pudgy Pig created a problem because George was doing some art, and I think somebody from Warner Brothers said he looks too much like Porky. So the editor at the time said, make one of his ears hang down, make him look a little different. But Pudgy didn't last long. Pudgy was only around maybe 2 or 3 issues of the comic book. So, but yeah, George said they did have some trouble with that.
Oh, people, what do you do?
Yeah.
Well, I know you sent us a bunch of photos, and we have some of the Dick Tracy ones and others that that people can go see. But what finally got you all to start the whole Lum and Abner Society?
Oh, well, that goes back to 1983.
Right.
And I'll go back even farther than that. I told you that my dad had mentioned Lum and Abner to me as a kid. Dr. Joe Oliver played a 15-minute Lum and Abner show on KSAU at Stephen F. Austin State University. That got me, I was already into old-time radio, but it was the next summer, 1981. There's a radio station, an AM station in Gilmer, Texas, Christian radio station that started running Lum and Abner every day. First it was 5:30 in the evening, and then I think they switched it to 12:15 or so. And I started listening, started setting up my recorder, recording it every day. And a friend of mine named David Miller, who was also a radio show collector, lived in the Dallas area. I would send them to him. And at first he wasn't impressed, but then suddenly he got hooked. And when he got hooked, he got enthusiastic. He started making phone calls. He called Mrs. Locke, Chet's widow, and talked to her. He spoke to a fellow who had written a number of articles, George Lilly, who was an early proponent or an early promoter of Lum and Abner as far as reruns in the 1960s. And it was through George Lilly that I was put in touch with Sam Brown in Dongola, Illinois, and because he had contacted Mr. Lilly as well. And before long, we were talking, heard about this guy named Tim Hollis. Sam and I met in Pine Ridge for Lum and Abner Day in 1982 for the first time, and hit it off like long-lost friends and became very good friends. And then in 84, I believe it was, Sam and Tim and Rex Riffle met again, or met for the first time together, I guess, in Pine Ridge. And I wasn't there at that time, but somehow in all of that confusion, it was proposed to start the National Lum and Abner Society. And we started publishing the Jot 'em Down Journal in the summer of 1984.
And for those who don't know, the Jot 'em Down Journal, because the store that Lum and Abner ran was the Jot 'em Down store. Anyway,
right.
Go ahead.
Yes. And that was Tim's title. Tim created the title, the Jot 'em Down Journal. And we started publishing and started seeking information. And it started as just a simple photocopy on paper publication. It became a very slick publication. In 1990, or 91, Sam started recording cassettes, reading the journals because we were hearing from blind fans that said, I enjoy the journal. I have to have somebody read it to me. This is before screen readers, and of course, you know this technology better than I do, but before any type of technology was available. And Sam said, well, I'll tell you, I'll just start reading it on tape and I'll make copies. Just started very simply. And from then on until the last issue in 2007, Sam would record a cassette every other month, or when we went quarterly, 4 times a year. And he would mail those to the blind members who would listen to those. And sometimes they would keep them and sometimes they would return them for Sam to recycle. But incidentally, those are all online now.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I've actually looked at a few of those. Those are kind of fun. So the Lum and Abner Society got formed, and then you started having conventions.
Yes. Yes, first convention was in 1985. And we did a lot of things with, we would do recreations. We would do a lot of new scripts, where if we had someone that, we got to the point where we would have people that hadn't worked with Lum and Abner. So we would have Lum and Abner meet the Great Gildersleeve. Actually, Willard had worked on the Lum and Abner half-hour show at some point, I believe. Les Tremaine had never worked directly with them, but he was in some Horlicks malted milk commercials in the 1930s. And, of course, the Lone Ranger was never on the Lum and Abner show and vice versa until we got hold of it. So we had Fred Foy in 1999, and he agreed to be the announcer narrator and play the part of the Lone Ranger. So we did Lum and Abner Meet the Lone Ranger, which was a lot of fun. We had Parley Bear, so Lum and Abner met Chester of Gunsmoke. And those were just a lot of fun to do. And Tim would write some of them, I would write some of them, or we would collaborate back and forth to come up with these scripts.
Did Lum and Abner ever meet Superman?
No, we never got to that. That would have been great. Yeah, if we could have come up with somebody who had played Superman, that would have been a lot of fun. We had Lum and Abner meet Kathy Lee Crosby as herself. Yeah, they met Frank Brzee one time.
That must have been fun.
It was a lot of fun. We had some people would recreate the characters. We had the lady who had played Abner's daughter, Mary Lee Robb, replay. She played that character again 50 years later, coming back home to see family. Several other things. We had Lum and Abner meet Gumby one time, of all things.
Boy.
We had Dal McKinnon as a guest, and we had Kay Lineker come back and reprise one of her roles, the role she played in the Lum and Abner movie. Bob's Watson did that as well. Some years we didn't have a script, which I regret, but we had other things going on. We had anniversaries of Lum and Abner movies that we would play. So whatever we did, we tailored it around our guest stars, like Dick Beals, Sam Edwards, Roby Lester. Gee whiz. I know I'm leaving people out.
Well, that's okay, but certainly a lot of fun. What cartoonist really influenced you as a child?
Oh, wow. I would say the first thing I saw that got my attention was the Flintstones on primetime television. The Hanna-Barbera primetime things. Certainly Walt Disney, the animation that they would run, that he would show, and the behind-the-scenes things that would be on the Disney show. Things like almost anything animated as a kid got my attention. But Walter Lantz, on the Woody Woodpecker show, used to have he'd have little features about how animation was done, and that inspired me. That just thrilled me. I read Fred Laswell's Snuffy Smith, Chester Gould's Dick Tracy. That's why the Dick Tracy connection later was such a big deal for me. Almost anything in the Sunday comics that was Bigfoot, in other words, the cartoony, exaggerated characters are sometimes called Bigfoot cartooning or Bigfoot characters. those were always the things I looked for. Bugs Bunny, any of the people that worked on those, some were anonymous. And years later, I started learning the names of who drew Popeye, like L.Z. Segar, the originator, or Bud Sagendorf, or George Wildman, and then later Hy Eisman. But people like that were my heroes. Later on, I was interested in, I would read the Batman comics, or I would see Tarzan in the newspaper.
Mm-hmm.
I admired the work of Russ Manning.
Do you know the name Tom Hatton?
Yes, I do.
Yeah.
Yes.
Because
Yes.
Tom did Popeye shows on KTLA Channel 5 when I was growing up, and he was famous for, as he described it, squiggles. He would make a squiggle and he would turn it into something, and he would
Yes.
draw right on TV, which was so much fun.
We had a guy in Memphis who did the same thing. His name was, he's known as Captain Bill, C-A-P, Captain Bill.
Captain
and he
Bill.
did very much the same thing. He'd have a child come up. I think in some cases they're called droodles is one word for them. There was
Yeah.
in Tim Hollis's area, there was Cousin Cliff Holman who did that, and he might have a kid draw a squiggle, and then he would create something from it right there on the spot. A very similar type of thing, or a letter of the alphabet, or your initials, that sort of
Yeah.
thing.
Yeah, Tom did that for years. It was fun. Of course, I couldn't see them, but he talked enough that I knew what was going on. It was kind of fun. My brother loved them.
Yeah.
So later on, when you got to be a teenager and beyond, what cartoonist maybe influenced you more?
Well, I would have to say George, probably because I was corresponding with him.
Right.
Also, I would see the work of Carl Barks, who created Uncle Scrooge McDuck and the Donald Duck comics and all that. His stuff was all in reprint at that time. He was still living, but I didn't know he could be contacted. I didn't try to write to him.
Right.
Years later, I did get an autograph, which was very nice. But those people, a lot of people, Neil Adams, who did Batman, the guys at Charlton Comics, Steve Ditko, who was the co-creator of Spider-Man, but he had a disagreement with Stan Lee and went back to Charlton Comics and just turned out thousands of pages. But his work was inspirational. Another was Joe Staten, who was working at Charlton Comics, who I got to work with on several projects later on. And I would say just all of those guys that I was reading at the time. Pat Boyette was another Charlton artist. I tend to gravitate toward the Charlton Company because their artists weren't contained in a house style. They were allowed to do their own style. They didn't pay as much, but a lot of them were either older guys that said, I'm tired of the DC Marvel system. I want to just, have creative freedom. Charlton said, come on, we need it. And so they would work there, and less stress, less money probably. One guy named Don Newton started there and became a legend in the industry at other companies. So I found all of those guys inspiring, and I felt I could learn from all of them.
Well, you always wanted to be a cartoonist. Did you have any other real career goals? Like, was teaching a goal that you wanted to do, or was it just cartooning?
It was just a secondary, as I said, when I started, I thought I'll just do that for a few years. I didn't know it was going to be like 27, but, we had a lot of success. I had some student groups that would enter, video competitions, and for 20 straight years, we placed either first, second, or third, in state competition with one entry another every year, and that was notable. I mean, I give the kids the credit for that. But then about 5 or 6 of those years, we had what we call state championship wins. We were like the number one project in the state of Texas. So we had some great success, I think, in that. So a lot of years there, I really, that was a blessing to me, was that career. It just got to be too much, and it was time for a change after a while.
Was art just a talent that you had, and cartoon drawing a talent you had, or I don't remember how much you said about? Did you have any real special training as such?
Well, all of my training was, I just couldn't afford to go to a specialized school. You know, at one time, the Joe Kubert School opened just about the time I graduated high school. It was in New Jersey. I just couldn't make that happen. So I went to state uh, colleges and universities and did the best I could. I took commercial art classes, drawing classes, design classes, even ceramics, which came in very handy when I did some sculpting here in the last 8 or 9 years and worked as an assistant to a sculptor named Bob Harness, who lives here in Carthage. Um, but I never had any actual comic strip slash comic book training. So I learned as much of that as I could from guys like George Wildman.
Mm-hmm.
And then after I started the Lum and Abner comic strip, an artist named Jim Amish, who worked for Marvel, did a lot of work for the Archie comics, and tremendous inker is his. He's really a tremendous inker and does a lot of ink work over other artists' pencils. Jim would call and say, he said, I want to give you some advice. I'm like, okay. At 3 a.m., he's still giving me advice. So I'd go around for 2 or 3 days feeling like a failure, but then I would think about all the lessons, that he had told me. And so I learned a lot from Jim, and tremendous guy. And I would listen to what sometimes High would call up and say, why did you use that purple? Beg your pardon. So it was fun. I mean, those fellows would share with me, and I learned a great deal from those guys.
Are you in any way passing that knowledge on to others today?
I don't know that I am. I've had an offer or two to do some teaching. I just don't know if I'm going to get back into that or not.
Yeah,
I'm so at this point focused on quote unquote being a cartoonist and trying to make that age 5 dream a reality that I'm not sure I'm ready to do that again. And I'm not 21 anymore.
I didn't know whether you were giving advice to people and just sort of informally doing it as opposed to
Well,
doing formal teaching.
well, informally, yes. I mean, if anybody asks, I'll be glad to share whatever I can. But
Yeah.
I'm not teaching any classes at this point.
Well, you have certainly taken Lum and Abner to interesting places and new heights. One thing that attracted me, and we talked about it before, was in 2019, Lum and Abner in Oz, which was that was
Yeah.
fun.
Well, the credit for that goes to Tim Hollis. Tim wrote that as a short story years ago when he was first interested in Lum and Abner. And I don't know if he ever had that published through the International Oz Society or not. I don't remember. But Tim later turned that into a radio script when we had a batch of guests. This was in 2001. We had, let's see, Sam Edwards, Dick Beals, Roby Lester, and Rhoda Williams. And each of them had done something related to Oz, either the children's records or storybook records or animation or something. They were involved somewhere in some type of Oz adaptation. So Tim turned his short story into a radio script that we performed there at the convention. So that was a lot of fun. And then he suggested, why don't I turn that into a comic strip story? So that's what we did. But that was fun.
Yeah,
And we used the recordings of those people because they had given us permission, to use a recording however
sure.
we saw fit. The only problem is we had a mistake. The fellow that was running the sound had a dead mic and didn't know it.
Oh
And
gosh.
so some of them were a bit off mic in that audio, but we did the best. I did the best I could with it.
It sounded good. I
Oh,
certainly have no
thank you.
complaints.
Thank you for that.
Yeah, as I said, no complaints at all. I think it was really fun and very creative, and it's kind of really neat to see so much creativity in terms of all the stuff that you do as a cartoonist. Me having never seen cartoons, But I learned intellectually to appreciate the talent that goes into it. And of course, you guys do put the scripts together every week, which is a lot of fun to be able to listen to them.
Well, and that was the audience I hoped that we would tap into right there. And it was guys like you that would talk to me and say, what am I going to do? I can't see it. So that's why the audio idea came about. And it's taken on a life of its own, really. And we've got Mark Ridgway,
Yeah.
who has created a lot of musical cues for us that we use. And of course, Dr. Oliver. And
who plays the organ?
that's Mark Ridgway.
It is Mark. Okay.
Yes, yes. And it's actually digital, I'm sure. I think it's a digital keyboard.
Yeah, I'll bet it is. It's a really good sounding one though.
Yes, yes. There are a few cues that I did, which probably are the ones that don't sound so good. So, like if we ever need really bad music, if you remember the story we did, and I don't remember the name of it. What did we call it? Anyway, Lum tries to start a soap opera. I think this was about a year ago.
Yeah.
And Cedric is going to play, I don't remember if it was an organ or a piano, and I don't remember what he played, but whatever it was, I think it was Mary Had a Little Lamb.
Mary Had a Little Lamb on the piano, sort of, kind of.
It was played very badly. Well, that was
yes, it was
on purpose. When Lum tries to play the saxophone, that was me. And I hadn't played this. I used to play the sax. In fact, I played in a swing orchestra here in Carthage, Texas, for about 5 years, back from the early 90s. And so I had this idea, and I hadn't played the horn probably in 20 years. So I got it out, and I thought, it's going to sound terrible because it needs maintenance, but it doesn't matter. It's Lum playing it. Yeah. So I got to play really badly. And it was perfect.
It was perfect, yeah.
Because it had to sound bad.
How do y'all create all these different plots? I remember so many, like the buzzard, and
oh yeah, that was fun.
And so many. How do you come up with those?
Well, I used to get some really good ideas while mowing the yard. Don't ask me why. Or I'd get ideas. I'd get ideas in the weirdest places. Sometimes I have ideas in the shower, and I say, I better write this down. Sometimes I'll wake up in the middle of the night with an idea. But the ideas just come to me. The buzzard was fun. I'd had that one cooking in my mind.
That was pretty creative.
Time.
Yeah.
The one about, let me see. Oh, there was one we did where it wasn't the buzzard. What was that other one I called? The whisper. Yeah, there was a strange voice that was coming. Lum thought it was coming from his radio, and he turns his radio off, and he still hears it. And it was a villain who had somehow hypnotized everyone so that they wouldn't see him. And he would use his voice only. And then there's a character I came up with, and let me see. Larry Gassman played it, and I called him Larry John Walden. And he was the only guy. He was blind. He was the only guy that wasn't hypnotized because he couldn't see I use the old thing about the watch in front of the eyes. I mean, he was the only guy that wasn't hypnotized, so he wasn't fooled by the whisper. And he could track him because his hearing was so acute that he was able to find him. In fact, I think he could hear his watch ticking or something like that. So he was the hero of that piece. But well, I just think up ideas and write them down. Tim Hollis has written some of the scripts, maybe 3 or 4 for me. I've adapted some scripts that Lum and Abner did that were never broadcast, or that were never recorded, rather. I've adapted a few, written several, and I keep saying, well, when I completely run out of ideas, I'll just have to quit. But,
hopefully that never happens. What are your future plans?
Well, right now there's nothing major in the works other than just maintaining the strip, trying to continue it, trying to make it entertaining, and hopefully doing a little work on the website and getting it into the hands of more people. And I'd like to increase newspaper coverage if at all possible. and because this thing doesn't, it's got to pay for itself somehow.
Yeah.
So, I'm not getting rich by any means, but I want to keep it fun. I want to keep having fun with it. Hopefully, people will enjoy it. Hopefully, we can reach younger readers, listeners, and hopefully Lum and Abner can appeal to even younger audiences yet so that we can keep those characters going.
Yeah, there's so much entertainment there. I hope that happens. Now, in the life of Donnie Pitchford, is there a wife and kids?
Yes, there's a wife of almost 40 years. We unfortunately don't have any children. We almost feel like we adopted several children all the years we were teaching. We've adopted several cats along the way, and so we've had cats as pets for almost ever since we were married. But that's she's great. She's been my best friend and supporter all these years, and we're members of First Methodist Church here in Carthage, Texas, and doing some volunteer work there, and helping to teach Sunday school, and very involved and active in that church. So
I have a cat, and I hear her outside, not outside the house, but outside the office here. She wants me to go feed her, and we shaved her yesterday because her hair gets long and mats very easily. So
yes.
She got shaved yesterday, so she's probably seeking a little vengeance from that too. But my wife and I were married 40 years. She passed away in November of 2022. So it's me and Stitch the cat and Alamo the dog, and Karen is monitoring us somewhere. And as I tell everyone, I've got to continue to be a good kid, because if I'm not, I'm going to hear about it. So I got to be good. But it's a lot of fun. Well, yeah. I want to thank you for being with us today. This has been a lot of fun. I've learned a lot, but it's just been great to have another podcast talking about old radio shows. Mm-hmm. And you said, again, if people want to reach out, they can go to lumandabnercomics.com. If people want to talk to you about doing any kind of cartooning or anything like that, what's the best way they can do that?
Well, they can go to the lumandabnercomics.com website, and there's a contact link right there at the top of the page. So, yeah, they can contact me through that. Probably that's the easiest way to do it.
Okay. Well, I want to thank you again for being here, and I want to thank all y'all out there. That's how they talk in Texas, right? It's all y'all for everybody.
Well, some of them do, and some of them in Arkansas do too.
Well, yeah, and then there's some who don't.
Yeah.
They think that y'all means everything, and it don't.
Yes.
Yeah.
I don't think Squire Skimp says it that way.
Well, Squire, whatever it takes. But I want to thank you all for being here, and please give us a 5-star rating wherever you're listening or watching the podcast. Donnie would appreciate it. I would appreciate it. And also give us a review. We'd love to get your reviews, so please do that. If you can think of anyone else who ought to be a guest, and I think Donnie's already suggested a few, so Donnie as well, anyone else who ought to come on the podcast, we'd love it. Appreciate you introducing us, and, we'll go from there. And I know at some point in the future, the Michael Hingson Group, Inc. is going to be a sponsor, because we've started that process for Lum and Abner comic
Yes,
strips.
Thank you.
So I want to thank Lum and Squire for that.
Yes. Well, it's been my pleasure.
Well, thank you all, and again, really seriously, Donnie, I really appreciate you being here. This has been a lot of fun, so thank you for coming.
Thank you. It's been a great honor. I've appreciated it very much.